Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Afisnu Salam, and in this video I'm gonna do presentation about chapter 7 and 8. So on the chapter 7, comparative literary story. First one is what can we learn from comparative history? Blow's comparative research, particularly his 1924 book Les Rois Thaumaturgies, a comparative studies of ideas about kings' supernatural powers in medieval England and France, was highly influential and sparked a renewed interest in comparative history after the 1950s. However, its status as subdiscipline of history is still debatable, some scholars claiming that there is no single method of comparison. In many cases, it is regarded as a genre rather than a method of writing history, one that at best employs analogies requiring no prior methodological discussion. Number two is experimenting with comparative literary history. In comparison to national literary histories, comparative literary history represents any kind of progress. It is a paradigm shift, a shift in perspective rather than progress or a better opinion. For Cornish Pope and Neuberger, a comparative history like a national history is no less useful in imagining, in this case, a transnational area, and thus contribute to its creation. In the case of East Central Europe, comparative literary history will make sense if it advances, however marginally, communication between peoples of the region. But three, some relevant contribution of the AILC or ICLA communities comparative literary histories. The community's time-oriented history are extremely valuable contribution to the development of comparative literary history in and of themselves. They help the rethink the concept of the literal period and call into questions the projections of local time span in the international arena. Nonetheless, they have not developed their lexicon which would shape new direction for the comparative method beyond the links between various works of literature. Of course, this does not imply that the space-oriented histories are a better opinion. Number four is maps. Comparative literature, in particular literary studies in general, bear little resemblance to any basic spatial instrument used by other humanistic disciplines: history, geography, sociology, ethnography, anthropology, linguistics, or the social science, cartography, for example. This indifference becomes even more apparent when one considers how many primary comparative notions, such as European literature, Commonwealth literature, national literature, world literature, or emerging literature, reveal an obvious spatial character. Terry's maps are intended to substantiate the concept of cultural center, which is defined by other historians as magnetic poles of attraction of a symbolic cultural order, exercised by a two-way movement, centrifugal and centripetal in the interior regions of a given country's region, but centered around an axis. Number four is nodes. According to Cornelius Pope's and New Bayer's position paper, a node is a structuring concept of their comparative history, which acquire different meanings in the different parts, corresponding to different conception of comparative literature. Some nodes are temporal, topographical, institutional, and figural. A node is a hook within a network in general. Nodes are simply historical moments with a certain thickness that give rise to brief and incomplete transactional narratives that differ from national perspective on the events. In terms of the experimental condition of temporal nodes, the author is skeptical of traditional literary periods and their teleological nature. Column 4 addresses figural nodes ranging from national hopes and female identity to outlaws, trauma, and mediation. Number six is marginocentric cities. Another concept owed to the creative talents of the East Central European comparative literary history his editor is the marginocentric city. These are multi-ethnic nodal cities that have rewritten the national cultural paradigm from the margins, ascribing to it a dialogic dimension both internally in dialogue with other ethnic traditions and externally in dialogue with larger geocultural paradigms. Their very marginality, as well as their multi-ethnic composition, has allowed these cities to East and West at the same time, establishing a fertile nexus with cultural tradition. Chapter 8 is interesting comparison. The first one is the reciprocal illumination of the arts. Gianfranco Sobri published his, of course, the venture at Literature Comparis at the beginning of the 19th century. During the period of rapid expansion of corporatism as method in various fields of knowledge, Oscar Wilde, a disciple of the great art historian Henry Wolfen, would coin the phrase that best reflects this comparative modality in 1919 programmatic conference, the reciprocal illumination of the arts. Number two is the seven arts of modernity. It is indeed easy to fall into the trap of superficial comparison without rigor in the study of inner artistic relationship. But it is also true that semiotics, understood as a general theory of design, can lend to comparatives, methodological instrument, and conceptual precision. On a fundamental level, we encounter purely thematic comparisons that are not without interest, especially when developed in terms of Erwin Panofsky iconology. The inheritor of Ernst Cassier's philosophy of symbolic forms, mixed forms such as emblems of opera open up a vast field of study as well. Form and structure studies are also relevant, and there have been more interesting research on the homology of musical composition models, such as the sonata, symphony, fugue, counterpoint, and literary forms. Building on the work of Mario Praz and others, in this context we can see how comparative approach to cinema studies. The three is transposition, hypertextuality, post-processing. Literary systems, according to the group, the leaders, which is entirely interdependent. This condition structure in which each element, phase, or agent participates with or depends on every other element. In Thomas Mann's example, the producer is the agent whose result in the work, transformers, post-processor, dependent on the creator. It is the agent who reacts to the reception of the work, elaborating another product relative to the first. Within the literary system, this is involved filmmakers like Visconti, composers like Britten, and choreographers like Lumiere, whose work is realized to visualize resulting text available. Number four is music and literature. Given this, the identification of poetical musical science as symbolic by Peirce does not preclude us from distinguishing between them in terms of their arbitrary, conventionally, and ambiguous nature. The relationship between signifier and signified is much more semantically telling in literature than in music. However, the most natural and genuine connection between music and poetry can be found in the origin of the lyrics. The poem was the song, as evidenced by the popularity of the contemporary singer-songwriters. The shooting has never ceased to be an important part of the culture, but it has had moments of particular splendor. Number five is the plastic arts ekphrasis. For classical rhetoric, ekphrasis is a figure comparable to hypotypos and is understood as a vivid and intense description that attempts to make a material reality visible to words. This conception implies that literature is inferior for the plastic art because the image, sign, and are artificial and conventional as opposed to the natural icons which a painter describes reality. However, by the 18th century, the term ekphrasis had come to designate description in literary texts of plastic work of art, whether this was sculptu- sculptural, architectural, drawing, or painting. It is transformed into, as James A. W. Heffernan points out, a verbal representation of a visual representation. Number six is pre-cinema. There are two ways to interpret the term of pre-cinema. The more common acceptance today refers to the period before 1895 and the devices used to animate and project images before this date. In this context, one must consider devices such as the Imagic Lantern illustrated by the German Jesuit Athanasius Fischer, who discusses parastatistic or representative magic, the tenth book of his Ars Magna Lucis et Mundo, published in 1646, 30 years after the serpent's death, and acknowledged the advancement in this area by the Danish mathematician Thomas Walgeston. Today, however, it appears that the tendency to understand pre-cinema is in purely technical terms that has given the way a cultural and interdisciplinary contextualization of what has been dubbed the pre-cinematographic universe. This approach encompasses not only modes of visual representation before the end of the 19th century, but also iconographic traditions, popular entertainment, theater, and other technical art, and most notably stories and narrative literature, with the understanding that the all of these arts are intertwined and transmitted. And that's all about my presentation, and thank you.